I'm joined now by the composer of Respiration, John Fitz Rogers, from his home in Columbia. Alarm Will Sound's Alan Pierson, artistic director from New York. Hey. Gavin Chuck, managing executive director of Alarm Will Sound from Chicago. And Erin Lesser, our flutist from Appleton, Wisconsin. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to those of you listening. And some of you entered some questions in the chat during the concert, which we will try to get to. So, John, I thought we could start by talking with you a little bit about the compositional process, because I know we've discussed that this was not an easy piece for you to write, especially at the outset. It imposed so many challenges that you don't normally have to deal with as a composer. Among other things, players that really can't hear each other or see each other that well in real time, but are still trying to play together. Can you talk a little bit about the process and what you found challenging about it and how you worked to overcome those things?
Sure. The process really began by asking a lot of questions. I know you and I, Mike, had numerous conversations and many long text message exchanges. And Alan and Gavin, I spoke both with you several times to just try to figure out how this can work. I've never written a piece where players can't play together. There's always these kind of hearing issues. And so it was really it started with questions. And then I would say probably for 6 or 7 weeks, a lot of false starts. I have many discarded sketches and ideas that I thought, oh, well, this will work. And then I text you, Mike, and you're like, well, I can't really hear that, or I can hear this. And I had to kind of figure out my way as I went along. So really the first 2 months of writing this piece were not writing. Some of those ideas found their way into the final piece, but it took me a while to get my bearings. And once I got my bearings, I felt like, okay, I think I know how this is going to work. I think I can figure out how to do this, but it just took a long process of discarding ideas, which is normal, I think, in any creative endeavor. You get rid of things as much as you keep things. But in this piece in particular, just because of the rhythmic challenges and the coordination, that proved especially interesting, I guess.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about how you solved some of those challenges.
Well, you better than most people, Mike, know that I'm a fan of rhythm and rhythmic precision. I like pulse a lot. And so I couldn't do that. And I was just talking to my students today about the idea that creativity always has to happen within limits. You always have to decide what you're not going to do as much as you decide what you are going to do. And so I just had to kind of relinquish the idea of pulse, although you do hear pulse in this piece, but it's only one instrument, right? It's an instrument that can give harmony, or it's the drums later on. So I think in this process, this was a real revelatory process for me. I think in a way that no other composition I've written has been revelatory, in the sense that I learned something about myself. What I learned is it's not really pulse and rhythmic precision and meter that I'm so interested in. It's ensemble and community. It's the way, how do we interact together as musicians? Pulse is the thing that can bring us together. But as I discovered in writing this piece, it's only one thing that can bring us together. And so I decided that this piece really, and this was in conversation with you, Gavin, too, that I really wanted this piece to be about community. Because some of my pieces are about not listening to each other, but that is in the way we relate to each other. We don't listen to each other, we do something else. But this piece really taught me that I value the idea of musical community probably more than anything else. And so it was a real gift for me to kind of discover that.
That's really lovely, John. That really resonates with me. And it reminds me of one piece that I kind of feel in the, the ancestors of Respiration, which we didn't talk about, which is Music for 18 Musicians by Steve Reich, which is another piece that is very deeply about community. but where the relationship between the parts is about listening and about creating a sense of community, but it's not scored out in a conventional way where, like, there's a progression and everyone has to line up in a sort of ordinary way. It's also a piece that's also very much about breath. So I see it in somewhere in the like ancestry of respiration.
For sure. I mean, that piece is a deeply important piece to me and has been for a long time. And it's kind of hard not to have that be a part of this world. But certainly that piece is based on pulse, but
Yeah,
there's always a
right.
pulse that ties everyone together.
Right.
This piece doesn't sound like that, but the ethos, I think you're absolutely right, Alan, the ethos of that sense of community and how we listen to each other, how we can listen to each other over the internet and still feel like a community. That is, I think Music for 18 Musicians is really kind of the progenitor of that, for sure.
Gavin, there's a question about whether you can speak to some of the stuff that went on behind the scenes, like, in other words, production decisions, the technological considerations, and maybe disasters that did or did not occur.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I think that there are two aspects about this. There's one which is just a purely technical problem, but the technical problems and the technical solutions and the entire technological platform really is in service of what we value as artists, which is making beautiful things. So we had, in the initial concept building of this, we just recognized that Zoom and teleconferencing was just a condition of our lives. And if we're artists making music now, that should reflect that. So let's just use this technology. And we quickly discovered that it was not going to be Zoom alone, but it was because Zoom is built for speech. And for example, I think, as we all know from any Zoom call that involves 5 or more people, like crosstalk, basically Zoom is deciding who is the main speaker at any point. So we quickly basically divided the world up into audio technology and video technology. And essentially we use Zoom to visually communicate with one another and also to capture the performances. And then we tried a number of different platforms. One is Jamulus. We've used Clean Feed, things that are built for higher audio quality, but more importantly, that people can hear each other and that they can set balances either on their own or that an engineer in the background can sort of set balances so people are hearing what they can hear. Lots of problems along the way, many of them being simply the fact that 20 years of a conservatory music training does not tell you what a router is. So the logistical leap was a significant one just in terms of knowledge. But I think it's one that's worth taking for 2 reasons. One is that it got us to this point to make music. But I think there's something that's really fascinating about the role of technology in actual sound and music making. And it reminded me of an experience I had when I heard for the first time at Eastman, I heard the hammer clavier sonata played on an actual hammer clavier. I'd heard that piece many times played on a modern piano, and it's beautiful and whatever, and it's dramatic and so on. But when I heard it on a hammer clavier, an actual instrument, that instrument was at its breaking point. And it made it so much more exciting. And I heard across the centuries, I heard Beethoven figuring out technology. And I think that's something that's really interesting in what we've chosen to do here, to make the technology actually part of the artistic material, is that there's something about grappling with it that leaves its mark on the art itself, and that expresses something about its time. And, great pieces of art are timeless, but great pieces of art also hold on to the time and express the time that they're in. And so, like, I also edited the video and have been editing the video for these series. And, we could have brought in, I suppose in principle, 4K Ultra HD cameras. But no, we actually use the cameras, people's phone and webcams, and And the video quality is not what you would see in a highly produced video, but I think it bears that mark of like struggling with the technology, like the hammer clavier struggled with the sound of that instrument. And I think there's something beautiful in that struggle. And I want the work we put out to bear that mark.
Yeah.
I want to take a second just to connect two things that have been said so far. One is, Gavin, that great analogy you made of the Hammer Clavier Sonata and hearing Beethoven struggle with the technology. And the thing that John said at the beginning about, struggling with how to write this piece in these limitations and about how creative limitations can be. And I think you really hear that in the piece. And it's something that, I've loved all the video chat projects that we've done so far, but something that I think really sets John's apart is that he used these limitations to push him into a new way of making music. I feel like, most of the work in video chat variations we've done so far, you can feel people like taking a thing they were already doing and like adapting it to the medium. Whereas John, I really feel like you came up with a whole new way of thinking about time and music and independence and community, and challenge yourself to do something that was really new for you. And I think you feel that in the piece you gave us.
So one listener from the Columbia area is asking about rhythm in John's piece and whether or not the rhythmic durations were improvised or were they actually notated. John, maybe.
Sure. So there is one section that's written with time signatures, but it's written in such a way that if people are late or early, it's going to sound good. So I wrote it so that it could be blurry. But most of the piece, what you think of when you look at sheet music and you see a measure or a bar of music, that usually indicates a certain number of pulses. For me, in this piece, a measure is just a unit of time. And there's a kind of range that I give in the score. It could be, 8 to 12 seconds here. And this is really based on Alan and what he feels, kind of feeling in the moment. Okay, we feel like we need to move, or we feel like we need to hold back a little bit. So that flexibility allows, I think, for a kind of elasticity and a little bit of kind of performing in the moment. So the notes, the way I wrote the piece, the harmony is totally controlled. Everything, the pacing, if you heard another performance of the piece, it would still sound like this piece. But players are given notes and there's a lot of verbal instructions. So as I mentioned to Alan, learning this piece, I think for the players, the way I thought of it, I'll be curious, Mike and Erin, your thoughts on this. I thought it's more like learning lines of a play. There's not a lot to practice in a traditional way. You don't see, okay, here's 20 measures of difficult music and I've got to woodshed this and get this down. It's kind of memorizing these instructions that I give, these sort of detailed instructions. Here are the notes. Here's are some things I want you to do. Here's who I want you to listen to. And that has to be kind of spontaneous. It can't be read in the moment. And so it's almost like memorizing lines of a play in a way.
Yeah, it struck me, and you warned me about this beforehand, John, that if I was reading those verbal cues and trying to play my part at the same time, it just wouldn't work. I wasn't able to truly react to what I was hearing and fit in with that in the way that I sort of, and Erin too, I'd love to hear if you practice, for example, John's piece. I didn't practice it at all in a conventional way, but I had to think about it a lot and know when I'm in these passages here, this is the ethos, this is how active I need to be. This is what's going to be going on around me and what I'm trying to listen for. And I really had to kind of study the piece rather than somehow work out anything technically. Did you find that?
Yeah, I had a very similar experience where I was writing like one descriptive word over a bar or something, like giving myself more of an emotional cue to latch on to. But I really love this kind of writing. I think it's perfect for a piece about breath, because you really get caught up in what you're hearing in your ears and watching Alan try to get us a little more anxious, or create a current of activity, or then like trying to find that space and the ability to manipulate what you're playing in real time really creates, like you said, elasticity in a more authentic way than how we usually have to study and plan our breaths as wind players, especially. So it's really satisfying when it starts to go well. Like Mike said, there's a bit of a learning curve, trying to remember what's coming next.
But it's so freeing, I think, as a player. And as classical musicians, we certainly, and more, we're called upon to improvise. One notices this, I think, over the last 5 to 10 years. But there's still something so freeing about not being tied specifically to the page, but really making your own call by listening about where you're going to put stuff and how you're going to interpret a particular gesture, and which notes of those notes that you're given are you going to play, and how are you going to play them. Very freeing.
I should just also add that I played jazz in high school, a little bit in college, and I don't consider myself a jazz musician at all, but certainly that was very much on my mind. And thinking about jazz, and also thinking a little bit about the Duke Ellington Orchestra, and writing for the strengths of the individual players in Alarm Will Sound. What you guys don't know is I went and listened to all of you. I really wanted to make this kind of a personal piece and listen to what you could do and what works for you. And Mike, of course, I know you're playing deeply, but I really wanted to personalize it in that way. And of course, that really comes out of a jazz ethos as well. So that was an important inspiration for me too.
Yeah.
That's really nice, John.
Yeah. John, another one for you. Asking about whether Western art music notation was really not quite up to the task of representing what you wanted to do in this piece.
Boy, could I tell you stories about that? That was perhaps in addition to just getting my bearings in writing for this piece, figuring out how to notate to get what I wanted took a lot of time and a lot of very sleepless nights. Because no, Western notation doesn't really provide. So I had to figure out, I sort of used older notation, but I also had to figure out a way to do things. And, there's color coding in the score, and there's sort of lots of ways that I kind of had to think a little bit outside of the box to get the effect that I wanted. So the trick for me was to write this piece, but to make it feel like me. I still needed to feel like I'm not kind of wearing a different hat. I needed to make this a John Fitz Rogers piece. And the notation fought me every step of the way. And then when I figured it out, okay, that's fine. But then doing the individual parts, the sheet music for all the players, every single cue, everyone that they listened to had to be notated in the parts to create this kind of lattice work of listening. And that just took an enormous amount of time. So I was begging, could I have a little more time to finish this, because the notation was a tricky challenge.
It's interesting. The piece reminds me of, like, it feels and sounds like music that was created through a kind of oral tradition, which is another way in which it takes me back to Music for 18 Musicians, which was very much created within an oral tradition. Like, that was a piece where there was no score for the first 20 years of the piece's existence. And here too, it like often, John, the ideas that you had were so clear and often like rather simple in the best possible way. But then the notation and the text was this thing that we had to, take in, and that, because it couldn't be conveyed in conventional notation, we had to take in and get through the way you, as John said, the way you learn your lines in a show. To then get to the point where the ideas are internalized.